Welcome to episode 1 of the Budget Track Car Build series. So in this series, I'm going to be buying and modifying a car for track days as cheaply as I can. If this sounds interesting to you or is something that you've considered doing, make sure to subscribe below to follow along on the journey. In this episode, we're going to be covering the top 10 cheapest budget-friendly track cars that you can buy. But before I do that, I want to cover a few aspects before we look at the individual cars that can help reduce the cost of buying your track car. Now, inherently, the reason track cars can be quite expensive is that it's an unnecessary car. So, I mean, typically most people have some level of budget for a car of their own that you use for daily driving, something that you take your kids in, your family, your friends, etc. So you've got some money set aside for that particular thing. With track cars, especially if you build an out-and-out track car, you are spending money on a car that is only going to be used a handful of times. So I mean, let's say to a track day once a month, which is on the pretty high side of things, I think, typically, especially if you're going down the budget route. Once a month, that's 12 times a year that you're actually using this car for its intended purpose on track. So now if you work out the cost of the car and the utilization you actually get out of it, every time you drive it, it's quite an expensive experience. So I've thought of a few different ways to help reduce the cost of the car subjectively. Number one, obviously the fact that you aren't really using this car for anything other than for track use. A way that you could potentially reduce the cost or maybe increase the budget that you have to spend on the car is for actually using the car for other purposes. So in my case, I'm currently traveling to and from the post office, doing random trips to, I don't know, around town, the shops in my Mustang, which is proving not ideal. In tight London city roads, you have to be paying attention when you're driving the Mustang because you've got that long bonnet in front of you and sort of wide turns that you're taking. And also you can't just throw it and park it wherever you want it because a lot of spaces it doesn't fit, it's too long. And obviously you're conscious of where you parked it, how you parked it, in case it gets damaged or knocked or, you know, car park ding or something like that. So because of that, I've also been looking for a potential little runaround. But a great idea here is to maybe build a track car that can somewhat be used on the road as well, still retain some level of practicality. Therefore, I'm getting a hell of a lot more use out of it. I can use it as a daily runaround as well as a track day weapon. So it allows me to increase the budget a little bit because I was considering getting maybe a little smart car or something of that sort anyway. So yes, it technically hasn't made the car itself cheaper, but I'm getting more use out of it. Number two is if you are planning on going track days, most likely you're going to be going out with some friends who have similar passions. Now, either they're going to build their own track cars, which obviously is an added expense, or you can join together and build one together. So I've asked a few friends, do you want to build a track car? They said yes. So instead of having, let's say, a budget of £4,000 on yourself, you can split that between, let's say, 2 people and only spend £2,000 each while still retaining the full usability of that car. So you might be going to the same number of track days. Either they use it when they go themselves, you use it when you go yourself, or you can go together and actually just split the cost of the track day itself and split the driving time. So these options here generally make the car itself cheaper to purchase, as well as makes it a better value for money. And that's before we've actually touched on the cost and price of the cars and what cars you're actually going to buy. Now let's focus things on the actual car itself. So I've set out some criteria for me, which obviously can differ from person to person depending on what you're looking for in your track car. So for me, I'm looking for a car within the budget of £2,000. That leaves me a little bit of money to actually spend on mods. Number two, it needs to be lightweight. Lightweight is just because weight is a massive thing when it comes to track driving, because heavier the car, the more it goes through on tires, the more it goes through brakes, the more fuel it potentially drinks. So there are other follow-on consequences in terms of cost from weight. In addition to that, just generally a lighter car is more fun to drive on the track, nimble, more agile. It's just benefits upon benefits. Number two, I'm looking for a car that has somewhat of a decent power, but nothing too crazy. I'd say 150 is probably my absolute minimum, and obviously going upwards, top end of probably around 200, 250 bhp, depending on what's out there. And last but not least is reliability. Probably the most important thing here. I don't want a car where I go out on track, it can die on me. I don't want a car that is just constantly having issues and just money's being poured into it just to fix it and keep it running. I just want something that way I can buy it, modify it, and start racing it with minimal, reliability issues. So that's quite important there as well. Now, without any further ado, let's get down to the top 10 cars I'd consider personally for a track car. Now, how can we start a budget track car list without number one being the Mazda MX5 or Miata? Really great cars because they're lightweight, have a reasonable power, very tunable in the aftermarket, rear-wheel drive as well, so good fun. Very strong contender. I mean, literally any list I've ever looked online has one of these on it. In particular, if I were to consider one, it would be the Mark II Mazda MX5, just because the Mark I is getting quite expensive just based on collectors. So the Mark II, the 1.8, I think it produces around 138, 140 horsepower, and it's very light. However, my only issues with it is because it's quite an old car, reliability on things other than the engine may be a bit questionable. So in terms of sort of just bushes, gearbox, linkages, suspension, obviously these are all stuff that we're potentially going to be changing anyway, but just as an overall experience, I feel like being an older classic car, it may have some reliability issues. The other thing also is rust. Any advert I've looked at for Mazda MX-5 mentions rust in it, and not necessarily a huge thing. You're gonna have to get that sorted or buy a car that's already sorted, but I'm just worried about getting a car that seems to be sorted, developing rust in the future, or just having rust in it that I couldn't see when inspecting the car initially, and that's just gonna blow the budget out of the water, having to cut it out, weld it, sort it out. Why is rust an issue? Well, body rigidity can be compromised, so you're not gonna have as much fun going around corners, as well as just general safety. You want your crumple zones to be crumply. You want your body of the car to be, strong, rigid, so that you're not, squashed if you get into a crash. Whereas, you don't want it to crumble into a powdery mess of rust. Now, the next car is almost equally as popular online on forums, etc. It's the Renault Clio Sport 172 or 182. Now, these cars are great because they're really lightweight. They have really decent power, so a very high power to weight ratio. And again, because they're used so often on track, the aftermarket for mods and stuff is insane. The issue that I found is they're getting a little bit old and a little bit rarer as some get stripped out for parts, many have been crashed. So just generally prices are creeping up slowly, especially for one that's good enough for me to actually want to drive now and then on the road. It's an ideal car, but a little bit difficult to find. Next, we're bumping up the power a little bit more to the Honda Civic Type R EP3. Now these have close to 200 bhp, and again, they're pretty light. Bulletproof engine, super reliable, can do hundreds of thousands of miles if kept in good condition. I personally had one traded in to me when I was selling my Mark V Golf. The thing was rapid, it was quick. And if you were in the car scene maybe 5-10 years ago, you would have seen that almost every Asian boy in East London area would be driving an EP3. And that would just be because it's cheap and it's fast. Number 4 on the list is the BMW E46 330i. Now this is a car that I have had some mixed experiences with, and not necessarily the 330, but just the E46 shape in general. If you have followed my channel for a while, you've seen that I've owned maybe 4 or 5 E46s, obviously not with a 3-litre engine. Great chassis, great body, they look really good, I think. Probably one of the best looking BMWs from modern classic history. Power, good, very powerful. However, weight, they are pretty heavy. So again, this touches on to the side of cost. You're going to be running bigger wheels, tires are more expensive, brake pads are going to be more expensive and wear out quicker, and you're going to be burning through a lot more fuel on track as well. So cost-wise, in terms of running, not ideal, but obviously it's nice to have a BMW back on the channel, and probably would enjoy driving that around on the road as well. And they're available really cheaply right now because it's such a popular car. They're almost everywhere. So many. And kind of combined to this is the next one, which is the BMW E36 328i. Same kind of concept, rear-wheel drive BMW, can be stripped out to make it a little bit lighter. However, they are somewhat heavy still, and the 328 doesn't put out as much power as the 330 either, whilst not, saving that much weight. So it's a bit of a maybe on that as well. But obviously the E46 and E36 are absolutely great cars for track. That's why you see so many people on the Nürburgring using them, drift cars. I mean, there's so many of these going around. So definitely a strong car, but probably not the ideal one for me. Next on the list is another French car, the Citroën C2 VTS. They're fairly nippy, 100 and something odd horsepower and pretty light. I'm just a bit questionable about reliability. I don't know too much about it, but just found French cars that I've seen and owned personally just not to be great in terms of build quality. So I'm gonna just be writing that one out, as well as the fact that it's a little bit underpowered, I think, too. Number 7 is the Ford Fiesta Mark 6 ST. I think in other places around the world it's considered the Mark 5, but it's basically this shape. I think they look good, 150 bhp, fairly light, and reasonably reliable as well if they've been looked after. I think one issue is some of them that haven't been taken care of can burn a fair bit of oil, but if you find a good one, they're pretty solid. Next we've got the Lexus IS200. Pretty reliable car again, just generally Lexuses can run for ages. I think my dad's had two, both of them over 200,000 miles and barely any issues. It's a little bit low on power considering the weight. So I know that people who have done like turbo or supercharger kits on them, but again, that completely just blows us out of our budget track car budget essentially. So I'm going to be writing that one off as well. The Mini Cooper S. In all honesty, I've had a massive thing for Mini Coopers ever since I was a kid and I watched The Italian Job. I think they look cool, the retro styling, they're amazing. Really tempted by this. Price-wise, pretty cheap to buy, decent power, weigh not much, little go-kart handling, little things. Very strong contender. I think reliability can be questionable though on the early 1.6 engines. So I'll need to research more into that. And finally, number 10 on the list, we've got the Toyota Celica. Now, this is a 1.8 litre VVTLI engine, producing, I think, just shy of 190 horsepower. And again, they're pretty light, around 1.1 tons, give or take. Pretty rapid cars, especially in terms of power to weight ratio, and they look probably the most sports car-like out of the bunch. I think the one caveat to it is the interior, I feel, really feels outdated. So I'm not sure if I want to be driving around that on a daily basis with that interior. But then again, the main objective here is a track car, so we're more worried about the chassis and the engine really, and less so about the interior. Now that's my top 10 that I've personally considered. There are many more cars out there that are potentially good contenders. So if you can think of any good ones, make sure to pop it down in the comments below of what you have or would consider getting if you were building a track car. So having evaluated all 10 of my track car options, and honestly, I was going back and forth between different cars constantly because some of them were so close in terms of decision making, and there's pros and cons to each. Some more power, some are lighter, some a bit more practical, some are cheaper. The list goes on. Eventually, after maybe weeks of pondering, I have come to the conclusion that I want to get a Mark 6 Fiesta ST. Reason being, it's cheap to buy. You can get some for under £1,000 and pretty decent ones for around the £2,000 mark. They have got a decent power. It's probably on the underpowered side of things in this list, but I think it's reasonable. And down the line, it can be modified to produce a fair bit more power. I think without adding a turbo or supercharger or anything like that, you can get up to about 200 bhp, which is decent. Lightweight, it's practical as well, being a hatchback with a massive boot, loads of space inside, so I can use it for my other bits and bobs on a daily basis as well. Join me on episode 2 when I show you the things to look out for when buying a cheap track car in the £1,000 to £2,000 range. There can be some lemons out there, so you really need to sift through what your options are. If you enjoyed going through this and want to follow along on the build, make sure to subscribe below, and I'll take you literally through the whole journey from purchasing the car, modifying it, right through to actually taking it on track and sharing with you all the costs involved, any mishaps, anything that happens, it's all for you guys.